the moment as a consultant, but submitted his PhD over at the University of Arizona. Was a Fulbright scholar and attached to people who are working on the Harvard project of economic development. And then come back, and I think before you're working with the Central Bank Council. So again, as is very common, I think, amongst everyone, really diverse professional experiences that he's bringing together to talk about PBCs. But yesterday we were talking about the need for evidence and for facts and robust analysis, and Michael has just interrogated the database like a fiend. So if you'd welcome him to give his presentation. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about PBCs and insights from public data. This forms part of a subsection in some of my doctoral work, as Di said, and really wanting to focus on the data insights today. We can get into many rabbit holes. This is just a snapshot of some of the things the data can show us and can be used for. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, the traditional owners of the land in which we gather today, and pay my respects to them past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the room. So we've all seen in our workplaces that there's huge variations in the Indigenous organisational space across Australia. When we look at the broader space, the closing of the gap in 2023, there were some aspects on track, some aspects going backwards, some with no progress at all. And when we zoom into PBCs, we begin to see that the median annual income for a PBC is less than $100,000. The question I was interested in is, despite this, there are many native title corporations and Indigenous organisations that are performing extremely well by financial metrics, with many employees, tens of millions of dollars, and deep, strong partnerships and community support. So my broader research looked at what could explain some of these differences. Today, I'm just going to look at the data aspects of this. So I'm going to look at three different types of data. The economic data, and this is pulled from ORIC's annual general reports submitted to the CNTA Act. The development data, some of the NNTT Future Acts that Kevin just mentioned and agreements, and governance data, what we find in PBC rule books that we can learn about formal governing systems. And what I did with my research is pulling these together to look at what this can tell us about PBC income, PBC employment, but also the broader post-determination space. So I'll begin with the economic data, and bear with me, there's going to be a lot of graphs. So the ORIC data, for those of us who are familiar, under the CNTA Act, annual reports, general reports, and financial reports are submitted every year. On the right there, you can see an example of just a snapshot of some of the data that's submitted by PBCs each year. So some of the data that you can pull out of these reports includes membership, charity status, income, employment, age. All of that sort of information is what's included in this sort of data. So the big picture item, income. So across the last 3 financial years, we can graph all PBC income and start to see a few trends. So first of all, I want you to look at the red line, that median figure. So the 50th percentile, that middle PBC, has less than $100,000 in income. It is slowly increasing, but to deal with some of these discussions about resourcing, about meeting compliance requirements, about engaging with future acts, these income figures start to give us a broader picture. I want to emphasise, you can see here the 25th percentile, no income, and some of the larger PBCs starting to perform within dollars in the millions. What I want to emphasise here is a statistical thing first as well, is that medians and averages, when we're talking about PBC data, tell two very different stories, because PBCs are not the same. There is no one size fits all. They're not a bell curve of PBCs with everything smack bang in the middle with a few small and a few big. And so when you show an average, you can see an average PBC income of 2.3 million. But that's very deceptive, given that's from very large PBCs in the hundreds of millions, and doesn't take account. So what I want you to think of for all statistics and things moving forward is focusing on the median or that mid-range. Membership tells a very positive story, I think. In the last 3 years since this data has been readily available, we've seen 10% compounded annual growth in PBC membership, now over 70,000. And what the data shows in this PBC membership is that around 4/5 of that, about 8 of that 10%, is coming from new determinations coming through the system. And the other 2% of that is coming from organic growth within existing PBCs. Employee numbers speak a not so positive light in relative comparison, and we've heard some conversations yesterday about the way in which working in PBCs can be one of the other career avenues for anthropologists. But in also responding to the workloads, it's important to note that more than half of all PBCs have no employees at all, and that another 15% reported just one employee. And so when we're talking about capacity to respond to Section 29 notices, to agreements, to proponents, to rep bodies, this understanding that most PBCs actually don't have an employee at all, and that this volunteer basis is a real trending problem drawing on the communities that we work with. Now, I don't want to get too complicated here, but the table on the screen shows you some grant information. So average grant income comparing ACNC registered charities with PBCs. And what we can see, if you look at sort of those top 2 rows, we can see that on the smaller end, that PBCs have slightly higher income than the charity sector. Now, I'm not promoting that the charity sector is well funded, but what I'm trying to do is benchmark against what other grant income bodies are out there and where PBCs sit. And it shouldn't surprise a lot of you to see, in that $50,000 to $250,000 range, that there are a lot of PBCs at that 80,000 mark, which looks awfully familiar with the capacity building grant that's there. But what I want you to emphasise and look at is when we move to that large $1 million to $10 million range, we see that PBCs are actually receiving less than charities of the same size. And so what I wanted to look at is, well, is this an issue of the capacity, the same issues of capacity to respond to objection notices, to respond to court evidence, this capacity to apply for grant funding to drive some of these economic development initiatives. So I think notably, there is a lot to say about grant funding, and in fact, it only makes up, and you see it a little bit on this next slide, less than 1/5 of the income in PBCs in Australia. So when we look at state and territories, we also see a different picture. And not all state and territories and their resources were created equal. We can see here that Western Australia dominates more than half the income in the sector. But what this can show you not only is the differences in states, but also the differences on their dependence on grant versus non-grant income. So you can see here that places like Victoria predominantly dependent on grant income. Now that can be credited to the way cultural heritage is funded in that state. But at a broader picture, we see that different states through their state regimes also need to be thought about when we're looking at a national picture. Other economic data, I'm mindful that I've got 3 different areas of data to talk to. We can look at breaches of reporting obligations. So under the CATSI Act, at 31 December each year, PBCs are required to submit their annual reports, and ORIC usually publishes this about 6 weeks later. In 2024, there was around a 26% breach rate of those compliance reports, and 6 months later, while there's some time to remedy that, we see about 10% of PBCs have been in breach of that annual reporting. Now, this is consistent with previous years of data as well. It tends to be a common trend. Interestingly, the companies that are in breach, the PBCs that are in breach of these reporting trends tend to be your medium-sized ones, the ones that have just got enough to have to get financial audits, And that seems to be a trend that I think is interesting and could require some further investigation. Special administrations, media releases suggest there's been at least 18 over the past 16 years. That puts around 6% of all PBCs have been under administration by the registrar at one point or another. I'm mindful of time. Let's just check. I'll skip this one, and that's a beautiful graph, but we won't have time. Development data. So as Kevin alluded to, there's three primary methods for validating future acts. We've got our expedited procedures, arbitration, and agreement making. The expedited procedures, I want to stick just with the data, make up 80% of the future act notices. And the big trend is that the number of objections by native title parties is growing immensely. And they're occurring uniformly. And I provide that image on the side to look at a 3-year period recently in Western Australia. This isn't just some PBCs that are objecting to specific proponents. This is a very broad group of PBCs who are opting to object for a whole range of reasons in the system. I won't duplicate too much of what Kevin said, but the reality is that objection withdrawals are the most common outcome of an objection. And in fact, they're seemingly getting parties to the table a lot better, making up almost half of all of the outcomes. And you can see here with the expedited procedure applying as a third of the outcome, and it not being found to apply just under a quarter. In terms of arbitrations, the stats aren't too fantastic. We can see that of the around just over 500 determined arbitration decisions, noting that less than a fifth of arbitration applications actually make it to decision, results in a future act proceeding with no conditions. And I think Kevin alluded to here that part of the issue here is the resourcing of applicants to actually respond to those objections and have that information. But what I wanted to point out here is that in the entire history, there's been just 3 arbitrations where a future act was found to not proceed. And the last time this occurred was in 2011. The other part of this that's notable in terms of a trend, the right to negotiate period, which expires after 6 months. Traditionally, there's been a lot of criticism of that time not being long enough. And the data seems to show that it could really be around 5% of the proponents that may be abusing that system. That overwhelmingly, most proponents are acting in a fair and reasonable way and not using that 6-month trigger in a way that may seek to forward their advantages. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. Agreement making, all there is to say, the very detailed topic, is that there is a broad range of agreements. We tend to see a big focus on mining agreements and settlement agreements, but the reality is mining agreements are the 4th most common ILUA that the NNTT has. And I think that there is a really important emphasis to also talk about these other agreements that really have an impact on how PBCs operate. In terms of the timelines, there's something to be learned about how each of these different mechanisms for validating future acts can overlay and interplay with each other. You see here for low impact expedited procedures that the general objection period ends up having an additional 3 months for their median time to assessment. Your Section 31 agreements at a median take around just under 2 years. And that arbitrations, the first time the applications are received is actually the median time is after 2 years. So that point of arbitration really is coming later in terms of the data. And I think ILUA's that data isn't quite recorded because of the long nature of those agreements, but certainly there's scope to improve that. In terms of governance data, this is, I think, a topic and a theme that's been coming up a lot in this conference. So what I looked at is I reviewed manually every PBC rulebook that was determined before 30 June 2021 and coded 15 different measures to look at things like dispute resolution, the presence of a cultural body, independent directors, decision making, those sorts of things, with an intent to understand how and if PBCs have tailored their rule books to be different from the ORIT template or to be different from the rep body starting templates that tend to exist. Just some of the snapshots when we look at board of directors decision making and general meetings of PBCs. You can see that the most common voting mechanisms is just a simple majority. And as we step down, the balance of some consensus, some majority, and other forms of consensus votings are becoming more and more prevalent. But what I want to emphasise is there actually is quite a significant variation even within the system as it is, as to how these two important decision-making avenues exist, at least within the formal rule book. And I think we're all familiar with the divide between how a rule book is written and how things operate in practice. Cultural bodies, looking at the presence of cultural bodies in PBC rule books, make up, and I'm talking Council of Elders, Law and Heritage Committees, those sorts of things, make up 37% of, are found in 37% of PBC rule books. And importantly, the variations of the way these groups are empowered varies greatly. Some are included in dispute resolution, some for membership decisions, and many for just board consultation alone. But I think in understanding the role of these cultural bodies within PBCs, we can certainly see a lot of avenues and dealing with some of those three forms of governance that Kevin was talking about, that some of these cultural and heritage committees play an important role. Some of the other rulebook metrics, we can see staggered terms or rotational terms, so looking at when directors leave and take on. It's in 50% of all rulebooks, there's those provisions. Constitutions, preambles, which I think are very important in helping PBCs start by defining with a statement of who they are found in just over a quarter of all rule books. Independent director clauses, we have 45% of the PBC rule books have a clause that allows for an independent director, and 2% of the total have compulsory requirements for an independent director. And then agent and trust structures, I'll let the lawyers in the room think about that, but we see a fairly equal breakdown between when the court's going with an agent or trust structure, and it tends to slightly reflect rep body preferences in some respects. I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail. So when you pull all of these things together, when you pull economic data from ORIC, development data from the NMTT, rulebook data on governance, and even census data from the ABS, and you put them all together, you can begin to get a deeper picture on the quantitative nature and some qualitative points on what the post-determination space and what the PBC sector looks like. Now, regression models tend to show when you keep all things equal and you move just one indicator, what changes in the whole playing field. Now, I've tried to simplify, I'm not showing you regression models, but my aim in my research was to look at what pieces of the puzzle do you move and what are the income and employment factors that arise out of that. So when we look at PBCs across the board, we can see the biggest impact on income is a mining levy one. I mean, that shouldn't surprise anyone in the room. What I want you to draw attention to, and we're not going to have time to go through the detail of this, but the third and fourth point down from the top, the big ticket items of what's driving income. And it's dispute resolution and decision making within these governance structures. And the point I want to put forward out of all of this is that tailoring rule books or focusing in non-rule book based governance structures have an extremely high, at least on the quantitative basis, and I know all of us who've worked in the field have seen it as well, have a very strong impact on the economic and income metrics within PBCs. I'm going to stop there in order to have a little bit of time, but is to say that there are a lot of key drivers in income that we can focus on, and lots of other things that are commonplace that drive income. The regional economic situations, if the region's doing well financially and economically, the PBC is also doing slightly better than a place that might not have that. If they've got broader membership, greater labour access, greater human capital, tending to have better performance. Now, of course, none of this is all data. Do not get invested in data telling the full story. And I want to emphasise that there is no one-size-fits-all model for PBCs. But when we talk about this post-determination space, I'm hoping that data like this can begin to open up these conversations to look at the complexities of the sector. So I'll take some questions.
Thanks very much. I think a very stark and confronting set of statistics, which I'm sure everyone has experienced on the ground in the realities. So, questions?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really interesting to get that overview. And I'm just curious if you could elaborate a bit more on if you have any ideas as to why dispute resolution or how it is linked to income, for example.
Well, I think that it's part of strengthening broader institutional systems, so that looking at the fact that institutions matter, and that when PBCs have invested in strengthening those institutions, whether it's through a rule book, whether it's through setting up policies and procedures, whether it's through having an informal system to address issues that have come up in the past, that those matters tend to resolve other issues that pass through the system. And my broader research compares these findings with the US concepts of native nation building that look at these elements in the US, and strengthening governing institutions, having a cultural legitimate match. Those sorts of elements have come through over there in the US for decades and shown big income and employment growth. And what I wanted to see is, does that hold true in the PBC space? And it appears that it does.
Other questions?
Sorry, this is just continuing on the dispute resolution. I think, I'm not sure if I misunderstood you, but you said within and outside of the rule book. If the dispute resolution happens outside of the rule book, like what would that entail?
Well, pretty much every rule book should informally be resolved first nature of things. So there's firstly informal dispute resolution, and there's dispute resolution that actually never makes it to the PBC itself. And many PBCs set up a dispute resolution policy that's separate from the rule book or the ORIC template clause of, at 20 days we do this, at 30 days we do that. And I don't think I showed you my dispute resolution metrics out of one of the indicators of rule books, and I'm sure I could show you the breakdown of different dispute resolution structures within PBCs, but in the ideal of time I tried to keep you just a snapshot.
There's a question down here, and then one over there. So
which
the
person?
orange just down here. Thank you.
I actually was interested in the actual metrics for dispute resolution and decision making. How did you determine what good dispute resolution or good decision making actually constituted to actually make that correlation?
Yeah, so what I defined was not whether it was good, was whether they tailored the dispute resolution to move away from a template model that was provided. And so, because there's no point in me trying to decide what is good dispute resolution, the literature tends to show that when there is ownership of the system and the way in which it operates, that has a good outcome. And so what I looked at was, does it differ from the standard template models? Or in the cases of some rep bodies that use the same template, does it differ from the rep body's template model?
Kevin Murphy, thanks for a really interesting paper. I just wasn't clear, and maybe I wasn't paying sufficient attention what you were saying about correlation as opposed to causation.
Yes.
Because if you've got a whole lot of money coming from a mining agreement, then there's a whole lot of people motivated to help you deal with disputes so that it can be administered and distributed and whatnot.
Yeah. Good question. Had to answer it very detailed during my defence. So the reality is the research behind this goes through about 3 of the 5 prongs between correlation and causation. Correlation being just one, the very first point, do things statistically correlate? Causation being without a shadow of a doubt. So this shows statistically meeting about 3 of those 5 criteria to get there. Really, without doing qualitative data and getting on ground, it's not possible to get that causation at this point. But what I would summarise it as, there is strong evidence of correlation with these factors moving towards a causation-based argument.
Any other questions?
Hi, I was wondering if you saw the inverse with the decision making and like the PBCs that went into administration, and like the one they didn't have those kind of changes added into it.
I wasn't able to, I'm not sure I could, didn't go into whether there'd been an administration and what outcomes they have had. I think it comes down very differently for a whole range of administration circumstances and the reason, but it's a good thing that could be looked at.
One last question, please.
Hi, you said that you talked about how PBCs receive less grant funding than charities of a similar size. Do you have any thoughts about why that might be? Are they focusing more on the other streams of income? Is there some kind of reluctance from government to give grants to PBCs?
I think there's a couple of factors in there. Firstly, what's on the books doesn't account for grants that come through rep bodies. So there is that discrepancy, which I noted in the PowerPoint. I think the other part of it is that if the majority have no employees, where is the capacity to write grant applications? And I think that that's a big part of this.
Okay, thanks very much. You really important.